Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Conscious Grief Series 5. And today I am joined by a very special guest, Mark Anthony, JD Psychic Explorer, also known as the Psychic Lawyer. Mark is a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits, and he is an Oxford-educated attorney licensed to practice law in Florida, Washington, D.C., and before the United States Supreme Court. So Mark has a very interesting background, being a lawyer, but also being a psychic medium. And today we're going to talk about the afterlife and how speaking with a medium can help so much with grief, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And so welcome, Mark. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Tara, and it's an honor to be part of this. This is a very important event that you're doing, and I want to thank you for putting this together.
Well, thank you. And we call this the Conscious Grief Series. And, what we're really going to talk about is how consciousness lives on. You have a very fascinating family, and how you became... you decided to give up the law and become a medium. So perhaps you'd like to talk about that first.
Well, I was born a medium. And when I was about 3.5 years old, I started interacting with spirits. And it's not unusual for a toddler to have invisible friends. But when mommy and daddy can see who I'm talking to, and what's really fascinating is I've tracked psychic ability, mediumistic ability in my family back 4 generations into the 1890s on both sides of the family. And both sides of the family could not possibly have been more different, Tara. My mother's family came from Italy, and her great-grandmother, Giovanna, came to the United States just after 1900, and she gained a reputation in the Italian American, the Catholic community of North New Jersey and New York City as the woman who knows things. In fact, Catholic officials, from nuns all the way up to cardinals, used to come and talk to her about doctrine, about faith, about spirituality. And then my mother inherited those abilities. In fact, even in 2016, PBS, the public broadcasting service in the U.S., did a 4-hour special on the Italian Americans. And they actually, Tara, did an entire segment on Giovanna referencing her psychic abilities. And it was such an honor to see that. And of course, on every commercial break, one of my cousins would be calling, "Did you see that?" Then on my father's side of the family, they were very white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Pennsylvania. And my father had 4 siblings, 3 sisters and a brother, and his sister Marjorie, like he, had mediumistic ability, as did their mother Isabel and their maternal grandmother Grace. But with them, it was something that wasn't openly discussed, whereas the Italians, it was looked at as a gift from God. And I've got many, many wonderful and some not so wonderful stories about things that happened to the people in my family with these abilities. And if people want to read about them, they're in my books, Never Letting Go, which is a guide on the journey through grief, Evidence of Eternity, and my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. So when I was about 15, 16, I really wanted to join the clergy, which is not unusual for mediums. I'm sure a lot of the mediums that you've interviewed and talked to were drawn to the spiritual, but I felt that it had too many rules and regulations, too many restrictions. And so I ended up going into law. So I went from one form of rules and regulations to another. And so this has always been part of me.
It's fascinating. But it was after your mother died that you got the message you wanted to work with spirits, so that your mother's message was to do this so that people understood that their loved ones were still here on some level.
I talked to a lot of people, and they tell me they will open up about their spiritual revelation and how it came to them. And maybe they were sitting on a mountaintop somewhere. Well, obviously, I was very close to my parents because when I was starting school, I was 5 years old when I started school, and my father said, "Don't talk about this to anyone but your mother and I." And I went to private Catholic school. And, I thought when I got there, oh, they're talking about angels and saints and all these invisible entities. And then when I was listening to what they were saying, I realized, let's not, Dad was right. Don't talk about this. And my mother and I were very, very close. My father and I were too. And one day I was at my law office and I started thinking about spaghetti. Now, it's not unusual for a boy of Italian descent to think about spaghetti, but I was like really craving spaghetti. And my assistant said, Mark, your mom's on the phone. And she said, "Hey, Mark, I made spaghetti. Why don't you come over for lunch?" And I thought, okay. And my parents didn't live that far from my office. And it was wonderful, Tara. It was just a beautiful lunch. My father, my mother, mom looked tired that day. She looked tired. And I had, as beautiful it was, I had a sense of uneasiness. And when I was going to leave, she said, Mark, I want to talk to you for a minute. And she hugged me and kissed me and said, "I'm so proud that you have been my son." And I hugged and kissed her too. And I said, "I love you too, Mom." And the next day I was in court, and the judge's assistant came into the courtroom and said, "Mark, you need to go into the judge's chambers right now." And it was a call from my office, and my assistant was in tears. I could hear her crying on the phone, and she said, "Your dad called, your mom died." And she had what's known as a ventricular fibrillation, which is where the electrical system in your heart gives out. She did pass peacefully, but I spiraled into depression. And the reason I'm talking about her heart condition, because we're going to talk about grief and heart conditions in just a little bit. Well, here I am, the senior partner of a law firm. I do litigation, criminal defense, complex civil litigation. I mean, I was the whole thing when it comes to practicing law, and it had to be real intense and all this. And I'd say about 2 weeks after my mother passed, Tara, I was driving back from court. And grief is this very strange thing. It hits you in different ways. And I thought I'd gotten to the point where I was being able to control it, but grief is like a wave. And every now and then a wave, if not a tsunami of it, hits you. And one was hitting me. And I figured, okay, I better pull over. So I pulled over into this parking lot of a small market. And I thought, I can't go into my office crying. I got to get over this and, get my composure. And suddenly, Tara, I felt this flash of light. Now, was it a flash of light in the car, or was it in my head? I don't know, but I instinctively and immediately turned to the passenger side. And there in the passenger seat for just a few seconds, I saw my mother's silhouette in this silver white light. I mean, I will never forget this. And so I'm like overwhelmed, and then her voice fills my head. And she said, "Mark, you have been given the gift of mediumship so that you would not be crushed by grief. But now you must help those who are suffering with theirs." All right, well, Tara, all right, I'm hearing this, and now I'm beginning to break out in a sweat. And I'm trying to process this. And then the next message came through from her. And in her voice, I heard, "It is your life's mission to help people understand that God exists, that heaven exists, that souls are immortal living beings, that humans can communicate with souls, and that we will all be reunited in the light that you call God." All right, so I'm now soaking wet with sweat, and all I can say is, okay. And I'm sitting in my car, and I'm trying to process this. And I'm thinking, if I tell anybody this, they're going to think I'm stark, raving mad. They're going to think I'm insane. And looking back on it, when I hear about these people who have these enlightenment experiences on a mountaintop, and it was so peaceful and groovy in granola, mine was like a fire hose right to the face. It was very direct. But, that's my family, too, very direct and very to the point. And the thing is, from that moment on, everything in my life changed. Everything. Within about 2 weeks of that, I was offered a job at a government agency to oversee court operations. And so okay, this was a step to let go of my law practice. Then I started working on my book, Never Letting Go. A couple months later, it came out, and I brought my manager, Rocky, on, and she got me a television appearance in New York City at MSNBC. And then right after that, we went to Harvard in Boston because she got me a speaking engagement at Harvard. And so here we are at Harvard, and it's right before Christmas, and Harvard's beautiful. If you ever get a chance to visit, Boston's a beautiful city, Harvard's beautiful. And we had these steaming hot cups of coffee, and it's cold, and everything's decorated for Christmas, and my cell phone rings. It's the elected official of the government agency. He said, the Republican Party is outraged that I have a psychic on staff, and you're causing me all kinds of problems, and you're taking too much time off work with this book and this thing of yours. I said, well, yeah, but this is my legitimate vacation time. So he's going on and on about all this. And I said, sir, and I respected him. He's a nice man. I said, sir, let me make this easy for you. He goes, how so? I said, please accept this as my resignation. He said, okay. So then I hang up the phone and I look at Rocky and I said, oh my God, I just left the legal profession. And Rocky said, Mark, take a look around. So I'm looking around. She goes, where are you? I said, Harvard. She goes, and what are you doing in an hour? I said, giving a lecture about the afterlife and signing copies of my new book, Never Letting Go. And she said, don't you think you're exactly where you're supposed to be? So that is how I went from practicing law full time to being a medium and a spiritual teacher and the psychic explorer, because I've had a lifelong fascination with supernatural phenomenon, ancient mysteries, and as well as theology, philosophy, and all the sciences. So I have traveled to several sites around the world to examine them, and the media labeled me the psychic lawyer and the psychic explorer. That's why my brand is Mark Anthony JD, which is my law degree, Juris Doctor, psychic explorer. So there's my story in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, because it's a fascinating story, and you're so knowledgeable in all these different areas. And one of the things that captured my attention was your prolific knowledge of the Bible and religious teachings. Because I've always been a seeker, and I grew up in various sort of different Christian denominations, and I was always searching, why am I here? What is the point of life? Where do I go when I die? And for many years, the only thing was the Christian church to sort of answer these questions. But I was fascinated by what we were told was the occult, and we must never contact mediums, and that's the work of the devil. And so I was fascinated but frightened. And it took me many years to get to a place where I had the courage and the freedom to contact a medium, and it helped me so much with my grief and the connection with my parents. So why do you think it's been taught to us in that way in the Bible, that we should fear the occult?
Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the Torah, aka the Old Testament of the Bible. And the problem, with all due respect, I venerate, I love Christ. I love what Gandhi said. I love your Christ, but I do not like you Christians, for you do not act like your Christ. And so many Christians take a salad bar approach to Christianity, and they pick and choose which lines from Scripture they like to justify their own political and ego-driven agendas. And it's in the book of Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 11, where basically it says, do not consult with mediums. The mediums are not of God. But here's the thing, being the psychic lawyer, when I saw that passage, I figured, well, why don't I read the entire chapter of Deuteronomy? And if you go further down to lines 23 and to 22 and 23, what it says is, if what the medium says is not true, it is not of God. In other words, if what the medium says is true, it is of God. Then let's jump over to the book of Samuel. I think the first book of Samuel, and this is where mediums really get a bad rap in Old Testament. Okay, King Saul. Saul is having a really rough time. His favorite and most trusted advisor, the prophet Samuel, has died, ergo the book of Samuel. So even though Saul had banned mediumship in Judea, he consults with the witch of Endor, who's really a medium, and she brings through the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who says to Saul, "Your time is at an end." And this is what Saul wanted to hear. And right after that, Saul is defeated in battle by the Philistines. His sons are slain, and then he dies by his own hand. And then David, the shepherd David, becomes the king of Judea. And so the rabbinical community of ancient Judea said, see, look at Deuteronomy. See, when you talk to those people, this is what happens. And this is where, you should never consult with a medium. But if you look at this as a whole, the prophet Samuel's spirit didn't make this happen to Saul. This was Saul's journey. He was to be defeated to make way for David to become the king of the Jews. David holds a preeminent place. He's right up there with Abraham, Isaac, Moses in the Old Testament. David's one of the biggies, okay? And when you go to the book of Matthew, it states that Jesus is a descendant of the house of David. So perhaps it was the will of God for David to take over from King Saul to create a lineage that resulted in Jesus. Then in the New Testament, if you go to the 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 through 12, it lists gifts from God, two of which are prophecy. The other is discernment of spirits. Okay. Now, will you indulge me a step further? Discernment of spirits, that's one of the things I refer to what I do. It's a discernment. Spirits are transmitting messages to me. I discern what they're telling me. If you look, I believe it's in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Mark, and I believe Luke as well, the Transfiguration. Now, this is the biggie. Transfiguration is one of the most mystical passages in Scripture. It has been pored over by not only Christian theologians, but also Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, because this is where Jesus takes a select group of apostles to the top of a mountain. All of a sudden, he begins to glow white, and a mist forms next to him, and then appears the spirits of Elijah and Moses. Fascinating, because let's start with Moses, was the giver of the law, the laws of Moses. Elijah was the executor of the laws, but Jesus was the embodiment of the laws. Well, needless to say, the apostles are a little bit freaked out because, Jesus suddenly glows white and brings forth two of the superstars of the Old Testament. And the discussion among Jesus and his disciples is, who do you say that I am? And some say that you are John the Baptist. Others say you are the prophet Elijah returned. Fascinating. John the Baptist was Jesus's first cousin. And John the Baptist was beheaded by order of Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, who had all the infants killed, and Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fled to Egypt because of Herod the Great. Apparently, the Herodian line was still rotten to the core. And so Jesus says to them, Elijah has returned, but they did not recognize him, and they will do to him as they wished, as they will the Son of Man. And then the next line says, they knew he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Okay, this is what progressive Christians, Hindu, Buddhist scholars, and other scholars who study reincarnation, it appears that not only did Jesus perform physical mediumship, which is the ectoplasmic materialization of a spirit, because when you read about legitimate physical mediumship. It involves a mist, a white light, the mist taking on the physical form of the spirits communicating. But then it appears Jesus may be referencing reincarnation. In other words, Elijah returned, but he was John the Baptist. Fascinating, because Elijah lived 8 centuries before Jesus and his first cousin, John the Baptist. So it is believed that this could be a reference in Scripture which relates to reincarnation, which in the early Christian era, in the 3rd century AD, Origen of Alexandria, a great Christian theologian, believed that we all live a succession of lifetimes, and even Satan eventually will emerge from the darkness to become one with God. Well, in the early Christian era, it's very possible reincarnation was part of a huge segment of Christianity. But then there was around 525 AD at the 5th Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, because then Constantinople was the center of Christianity. The Emperor Justinian and his clergy banned reincarnation as heresy, and supposedly went through the version of the Bible at the time, removing any other references to it, although that one remains, and possibly there's another one in the form of Jacob's ladder. But I don't want to get into, we could spend the entire interview on the mysticism of Christianity and Judaism. But my point is, Tara, when people say mediums are not of God and you're wicked and you're evil, what it is, when the Romans got hold of Christianity, they made it an extension of imperial authority. And the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, after the Council of Nicaea, it was declared that Jesus was God and would return. But until then, Constantine, Emperor of the Romans, is his representative on earth. And so now the emperor was being portrayed as an apostolic divine figure, and reincarnation wasn't jiving with what the empire wanted. So that's when they also created the concept of hell, that if you disobey the laws of the emperor and the empire, you will be cast into eternal hellfire and damnation. And I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version of that. I go into this in much greater detail in my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. Long story short, mediums are of God. Everything is of God. God created everything. God is not a neurotic white man sitting on a throne with a scepter smiting people. That's Constantine, okay? Because after the Council of Nicaea, depictions of God looked very much like the Emperor Constantine. And so people have to realize that religions have been openly hostile to mediumship because they don't want anyone to be able to get to God except through them, their dogma, their clerics. And by the way, you owe us 10% of your income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite right. And that people don't have agency over their life, what they think, what they believe. And it's also fascinating and equally at the same time quite devastating. But the good news is we're in a new age now where we have this awareness, we have this access, and we have this freedom. And yeah. I always think that if there's, a few things that come out of devastating circumstances of somebody dying and being left, and you're left here in this wake of grief, and that if you realize that there is an afterlife because you seek out somebody like yourself in desperation, because you're like, where is my son, daughter, mother, father, best friend? And you realize that this is not the only reality that we exist in, that your whole life and awareness is going to change.
Yes.
And this is powerful.
It is. And I want to, for the benefit of your listeners who are people of faith, please understand, I am not attacking or crashing on Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. I'm not saying don't be a member of a religion. What I'm saying is everyone can have a direct connect to God. and if it helps you to be a member of a religion. Because when you boil down all religions, they have essentially the same message, that our soul, the who and what we are, pre-exists the body, comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. We are all the children of God. We are all energetically linked and connected to God, and that we must all treat each other the way we wish to be treated. The so-called golden rule is a tenet of all the major belief systems. It's when people start using religion to justify political agendas and ego-driven agendas, ego edging God out, ego edging God out, ego-driven agendas that are based on anger, fear, bigotry, hatred, and violence. That has nothing to do with God. That has to do with humans seeking a moral justification for their agendas. Messages from spirits are about peace, love, healing, resolution, and protection. And therein lies the difference. I mean, we see in the world today, and I always try to avoid political discussions, but when you see terrorists who are motivated by a religion to go blow up a school or fly airplanes into a building and say they're being martyred, this is not a directive of God. This is a moral justification for an ego-driven agenda. And it bothers me when the media says, this terrorist spiritual advisor. No, that person is not spiritual. They're a religious fanatic. Spiritual people do not engage in anger, bigotry, fear, hatred, and violence. It's all about peace, love, understanding. And therein lies the difference. So when people say, oh, God told me to do this, like, no, your ego or someone else's ego that manipulated you encouraged you to do that. So I'm a big proponent of religion. I just don't like and when it is being used as a tool to oppress and discriminate and hate.
Yeah, I think it's a very important message to make, that this isn't about wanting to change people's belief structures and things like that, but actually you can still go to church and have that community and faith, and you can also have a direct relationship with your loved ones on the other side through somebody like yourself. So how do you feel like having a reading with someone like yourself can be a therapeutic step in the journey of grief?
Mediumistic contact with loved ones in spirit is an important therapeutic step in the journey of grief, because it helps you to understand that someone that meant so much to you did not disintegrate into nothingness. I think that's a really terrifying prospect. Someone that meant so much to you, they physically died, and then they're no more. And spirit communication, if done through a legitimate evidential medium, will prove that the soul exists beyond the physical, that there is a continuity of life. One of my colleagues, Dr. Gary Schwartz's wife, Rhonda Schwartz, who is a medium, she has said that we have one life and it is eternal. And so we come into, here's our life energy, and then we will then come into this world, and then we will leave this world and then move on and then come back to this world through a series of incarnations. I do believe in reincarnation. Everyone who's had a near-death experience, including myself, believes in reincarnation. Survival of consciousness studies tend to indicate reincarnation is the reality. All the spirits I've talked to reference reincarnation. Not one of them has said there's an eternal pit of fire in hell. And so there may be no hell, but there is reincarnation. So that even reinforces just as much to be nice to people, because your next lifetime, if you think things are bad now, wait till what could be coming. Yeah. I'm not trying to scare people. It's just that when you look at the religions and the people who've been studying reincarnation for the better part of 5,000 years, there's the unending cycle of birth, death, rebirth. And then karma is like everything you do has repercussions. We also know from the laws of physics, the first law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. Every great belief system teaches us that the soul, the consciousness, the who and what we are, was not created by the brain or the body. It comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. We know from neuroscience, the brain may be only 2% of the body's weight, but it uses over 20% of the body's electromagnetic activity. So we know everything's made of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms, which in turn are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are made of the smallest particle, quantum. That's for a quanta. And quantum physics is where we get that term. This means, Tara, that everything, you, me, the air we're breathing, the light we're seeing, the radio waves that this show is being broadcast on, the surface of the moon, the rings of Saturn, and beyond are all at the subatomic level composed of the same form of electromagnetic energy. It's just that things vibrate at different frequencies. So you and I, we are alive, corporeal, because our energy is vibrating at a higher frequency. The brain is an organ. It did not create the consciousness. Think of your brain as a computer hard drive. Your computer hard drive didn't invent the Windows program. It merely hosts it and all the data on it. So when our body / brain / hard drive dies, that gets uploaded to a higher frequency. And that's why I developed the term the electromagnetic soul, the EMS. And the electromagnetic soul is what we really are, pure consciousness that is a soul, a spirit, which is eternal electromagnetic energy, neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. And there have been recent scientific discoveries which appear to be validating my theory.
Yeah, which is also a very exciting time because, a lot of people who dismiss mediumship and other, dimensions, it's going to be soon proven, or already is being, if people are willing to look down those paths. You were talking more on the level of consciousness and atoms and neurons and so on and so forth. And with grief, we often think of it as this emotional impact on us because, it makes us feel crazy. We cry, we're very emotional. But it also impacts us very much on a physical level. And I do a lot of work with people in terms of yoga and breath work to try and release the energy of grief, because I'm quite motivated by my mother getting breast cancer after a lot of grief after my father died. But also when my father died, my great aunt and my grandfather, his father, both died within 2 years of my father dying. And they both died of heart-related problems. And I have just written a book, actually, and I say, back then, this was the early 1990s, we didn't know about this emotional impact on the body. And, you do talk about broken heart syndrome. So how can people begin to recognize this?
Broken heart syndrome is a very real thing. I mean, how many songs we heard about broken hearts? I mean, people have been writing about broken hearts songs about broken hearts for centuries, and certainly musicians always have. One of the most famous high-profile cases of broken heart syndrome would be when Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia from Star Wars, she died, and the very next day, her mother, the iconic legendary actress Debbie Reynolds, died. And we see this a lot, like in your family, but generally with broken heart syndrome, somebody will die, generally a spouse, or it could be a child or a parent, and then the corresponding spouse or child can die within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Scientists have begun to study the broken heart syndrome and found out that it's a very real physical phenomenon. The technical name is Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Now, that certainly is a mouthful, but let's understand what that means. A Takotsubo is a Japanese octopus trap, and it's a bulbous-looking sac that the Japanese put on the bottom of the ocean, and octopuses will go crawl in there. Well, what happens when somebody dies, let's say your spouse of 50 years dies, the surviving spouse hormones begin to flood the heart area, and it causes the left ventricle to begin to swell up, and it resembles a teikosubo, the Japanese octopus trap. And within 2 weeks, it can trigger a massive heart failure, massive coronary heart failure in that person. So when somebody dies, the people close to them, if they start getting like strange physical symptoms, you got to get them into a doctor right away, because if addressed immediately, it can be reversed. It can be reversed through some hormone therapy. But you generally see this in cases of people that have been married a very long time, or a parent who's lost a child. And people say they died of a broken heart, because literally they do, because part of your heart, your ventricle, left ventricle, begins to swell up, and then it cuts off the blood flow and it sends you into cardiac failure. So grief, I mean, and anyone who's lost a loved one, number one, emotionally, it hurts. It's unbelievably painful, but it takes a huge physical toll on you. And you know that. And a lot of times within a week or two, people develop a flu-like symptoms. A lot of people that's what happened to me when both my parents died. Within a week of that, I had like this flu-like condition, because it just devastates you mentally, physically, emotionally, and even spiritually. And unfortunately, the physical ramifications can be lethal. So when somebody in your family dies, watch yourself and watch anybody else close to them to see if they may be developing numbness on the left side of their face and body, tingling sensations, rapid shallow breathing. Get them to an emergency room pronto.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that there's sort of hormones that can help regulate the heart. And as you say, it's to be taken very, very seriously. Grief can have this huge, huge impact on us physically. I always like to ask people in these interviews, how would you define conscious grieving?
Conscious grieving would be an awareness that you have sustained a major loss and you're confronting it. And I actually think that conscious grieving is quite healthy, because the problem, particularly with men, I want to talk to the men for a moment. Guys, we are raised not to show our emotions. I'd rather die than cry. Okay, that is a very traditional, yes, and I know I'm being sexist here towards men, but men need to hear this. We have tear ducts, hearts, nerves, a nervous system, and feelings for a reason. It has been clinically proven in a university in Minnesota and in Southern California that tears of grief. Now, tears of grief are different than, you smell pepper and you sneeze and your eyes tear up. Those are called reflex tears, because you get tears as a reaction to something. But tears of grief actually contain the neurotransmitters which cause depression. So crying and acknowledging that you are in a deep state of pain and shedding those tears is actually good for you, not just emotionally, but physically, because it's getting out of you the chemicals that cause the depression. My father was a U.S. Navy SEAL. I never knew a braver or a tougher guy than Dad, and he told me a real man is never afraid to cry for someone he loves who's died. And I think that women are much better at acknowledging and embracing their emotions. Guys, we hurt every bit as much as women do. It's just that they've had the social benefit of where it's okay to express your grief and it's okay to cry. Well, it's healthy. It's the healthy thing to do. So conscious grieving is an acknowledgement that you're suffering, you're in pain, and you're crying. Now, guys, and even women, that doesn't mean you walk into the office at work and start boo-hoo-hooing. Go somewhere private. Maybe park your car. Don't do it when you're driving, but park your car somewhere, have a good cry. Cars are a great place to grieve when you're not driving. If you're alone at home, shed those tears. Because the thing is, You can't avoid grief. You can't outmaneuver it. You can't run away from it. You can't drink it away. You can't out snort it, inject it, smoke it away. You can't have impulsive sex to make it take the edge off of it. Grief is a very real thing, and it's a very human condition. We are designed to experience grief. It is something, it's a process that we go through, not something that we get over.
Yeah, such wise, wise words. And why do you think that it's just not been, we've not been taught in our culture to have those emotions and allow them to come up and out?
There is a very warped conception that expressing grief and crying is a form of weakness. Because a lot of times when people cry, it's because they're afraid and they're cowering in fear and they won't react. But the thing is, it is a real human emotion. Everybody is capable of these tears. Some people cry so heavily they actually shed blood. And that's an incredible state of stress. And you should never hold that amount of stress in you. Now, men in particular, the only publicly acceptable emotion, okay, for thousands of years, the only emotion acceptable for a man to display in public was anger. Well, how does that work for human history?
Exactly.
I mean, war after war, fighting, clashing, all this. And, guys, I get it. Dad was a Navy SEAL. He didn't raise me to be a whisket. And it's like you stand up to bullies. You stand your ground. Okay, that's fine. That's manly. But when you're hurting, and it's also in these people that say, well, I don't say I love you to her or to him because, they should just know. Rubbish. If you love somebody, tell them that. For God's sakes, tell them that. Okay, there's nothing unmanly about expressing love. And my mentor, who was a priest, Father Sonny, loved Father Sonny, beautiful man. And he said that we grieve as deeply as we have loved. Grief is the price of love, but a life without love isn't much of a life at all. So when you're in that grief, part of conscious grieving, I believe, is acknowledging that the reason I am in so much pain and grieving so much, because that's how much I loved her or him or whoever this person was to you. People grieve immensely over pets. That's also something that needs to be, you need to process that and acknowledge it. So, oh, it's just a dog, it's just a cat. Yeah, but that being was in your life, and the two of you shared a bond. And so you should celebrate to honor that, and grief is part of the way that we honor that.
It is. And I'm so pleased that you touched on the point of anger and how that's an acceptable emotion for men to feel. And I was in such a lot of unconscious grief for so long, and that made me hardened. And so my whole philosophy, like you're saying, is like, if we are able to feel our feelings and to consciously grieve, that will create a more compassionate society. Because if we don't do that work, we become hardened and we stay in the anger.
Well, can I add something to that? In my book, Evidence of Eternity, I introduced my theory of grief, crime, grief. I saw this as an attorney and as a medium. Why do people become drug addicts, alcoholics? Why do they engage in impulsive behaviors? What I started seeing is that with a child, a teen, young adult, there was an unresolved grief. Not all families are going to go to grief counseling. Not all families are going to discuss it. A lot of times people think, oh, he's just a kiddie. He'll get over it. They'll adapt. And what happens is, like I said, you can't outsmoke, snort, inject, sex, a grief. So the grief is not dealt with, and instead it emerges in other ways through alcoholism, drug addiction, impulsive behaviors, rage, anger. The grief leads to behaviors that cause crimes. Think of a drunk driver. Most people don't wake up one day and say, I think I'll become a drunk. I think I'll become an alcoholic. No, they're hurting, they're self-medicating. Same thing with drug addicts, all the addictions, impulsiveness, kleptomania, all that, it all has a root cause. So the grief leads to crime. You're so upset about a death that happened 20 years ago when you were a child. You get behind the car, you get drunk, and then you kill somebody. Grief inflicts crime, which results in more grief, and it's an unending cycle. And so for people who have children who've lost a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a beloved pet, you need to get that child in counseling. You need to discuss find out, what is your child feeling? What do they know? What do they think about death? The excuse of daddy's in heaven. Well, it's only going to work for so long. I know a friend of mine who died, and his wife kept telling the little boy, daddy's in heaven. Well, when is he coming back? And there needed to be the discussion, which she did at one point about this. So grief, crime, grief. I saw this as an attorney and definitely as a medium. And so a lot of times, let's say in drunk driving cases, part of the sentence is that they get into alcohol counseling. I would always try to get my clients not only that, but also into grief counseling. Instead of treating the symptoms, let's go to the cause. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the cause.
Yeah, quite right. Thank you, Mark. And lastly, I would love for you to share about your free gift that people can join you on your show.
Absolutely. Every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern U.S., 6 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Mountain, 4 p.m. Pacific, and all over the world. I co-host a show called The Psychic and the Doc on the Transformation Network. You can go to my website, afterlifefrequency.com, and you'll see in the calendar of events, and there's even an entire section about The Psychic and the Doc. You can click there for the link to watch the live stream. My co-host, Dr. Pat Basile, is a world-renowned behavioral psychologist. And so what happens is on the show, we discuss various topics and people call in. I will do a reading for them. I do a short reading, and then Dr. Pat, using her incredible experience and insights, help people understand what the message means. And it's a beautiful healing modality. There's no other show like it, The Psychic and the Doc. And that's every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern. And anybody can tune in if you have computer access. I understand we're on over 25 stations, terrestrial stations, AM, FM, in Australia alone. So we're worldwide. And that's every Thursday, The Psychic and the Doc. Please call in. Your free gift is you get a reading and you get the benefit of Dr. Pat's intuitive and uplifting insights.
Incredible. And that is midnight here in the UK for people.
If you're grieving, you might be up anyway,
Yeah, midnight's not so late at all. And like you say, a lot of people will be.
Tara, don't you think grief is worse at night?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And why do you think that?
It's so lonely.
Exactly. It's you never feel more alone when you're there by yourself, or even if you're sleeping, you have a partner in bed. 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, it's dreadful. And yeah, grief, the problem with grief is it doesn't have an expiration date. And people need to understand grief is a path no one wants to take, but it is a road we are shoved down, kicked down at some point in our life. And don't go through it alone. Like Tara said, nighttime is so difficult because of the loneliness. Reach out to your faith community, to counseling, to shows like mine, The Psychic and the Doc, to the Conscious Grief series, okay? This is why Tara is doing this. This is why people like myself and my dear friend Tina Powers, I know that you've interviewed her, and several of the other speakers are colleagues of mine. And that's why we do this, because we know how bad it hurts. And there is no Harry Potter magic wand that we can wave and take your grief away from you. It's a cross-disciplinary approach. You have to have some type of faith basis. You have to have support group, whether it's family, friends, or a support group of strangers who are going through this conscious grief series, seminars like this, or reading through a medium like myself, reading about grief. You have to reach out because the help is there. The help is there. Don't sit there and say, I'm all alone and nobody cares, because people do, because we've all been through it.
Yeah, quite right. And it is part of our human experience to feel a lot of pain as well as a lot of joy and love. So yeah, it's not easy, but like you say, it's so important to ask for help and find communities and sources to get you through this. Mark, it's just been such a joy, such a privilege to interview you. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. Oh, I did have one more question, actually, because in your background, I see all these interesting artifacts from around the world. And I was just curious, like maybe to share your favorite place that you visited.
Oh, I do want to tell people think that the rhinoceros behind me, I've had people say, how dare you have, that's a painting. And it's actually in two pieces and it fits in a corner to give the illusion of being three-dimensional. I do not believe in hunting, certainly not big game hunting. I mean, if you're a hungry person and you're fending for your family, that's one thing, but I'm a huge proponent of environmental protection. Gosh, where do I begin? I think that statue up there of the Buddha. I was in northern Thailand along the Laotian border, and there was a town by the name of Nan. And north of Nan, close to the Laotian border, was this incredible Buddhist temple. And I'll never forget walking up to it and had these gigantic stone dragons. They must have been like a quarter-mile long, undulating along the stone path, and then walking into the temple. And I was there with my friend Billy because he spoke Thai and Japanese and Indonesian, and he'd been living in Asia. So I went over there to we basically were exploring. And we're the only people of the Caucasian persuasion, probably for miles. I mean, the whole week that we were in this area, we didn't see anybody that remotely looked like us, and that was fine, And I had a discussion through Billy. He was translating with one of the Buddhist monks, and I admired that statue of the Buddha, and he gave it to me. And I said, well, let me pay you for it. And he said, no. And I said, well, here's $20. And when I gave them $20, they couldn't believe it. And later, Billy said, you gave them enough money to feed everybody here for a couple months. Because, when we were there, it's like, I think the average Thai made less than $200 a year. And it was the very least I could do. And then having that, it was like this, to me, it is a sacred artifact, and it was just such an honor to be able to help this temple, and for them to be so kind as to gift that to me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's fascinating travel stories, but the time has come to say goodbye, and thank you once again. And if there's anything else you want to say before we complete, then feel free.
Certainly, I'd like to invite everyone to visit my website, which is afterlifefrequency.com, just like my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. I invite you to sign up for my newsletter. You can find out about getting a reading with me. I do phone readings, just as accurate as in person. And you can also subscribe to Best Holistic Life magazine. I write every month articles in there. So I've got articles on reincarnation, UFOs, trips to exotic locations around the world, all sorts of things that people may find interesting. So please visit my website, which is afterlifefrequency.com. And I really want to thank you, Tara, and I want to thank everyone who has tuned in to the Conscious Grief series. This is the first step and an important step in healing. God bless. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Mark, and to everybody who's been listening. Bye.